His friends called him Lilo, which means cigar in Sicilian. His enemies called him a pain in the ass. The FBI knew him by his file number, 119495. Now, some men become gangsters over time. They may grow up in a bad neighborhood, hang out with a bad crowd, or have bad role models. Next thing you know, they're busting heads, taking bets, and doing time. And then there's Lilo. Lilo was born a gangster. According to his mother, he was bad from day one. And when your mother says you're a bad person, what hope is there? He was a natural bully, despite only growing to 5'5" on a good day. He weighed 160 pounds, but Lilo carried himself like he was 6'5", 300. In his mind, he was the toughest man ever created. Lilo was a man blessed with extreme intelligence. The only problem was, most of Lilo's brains were in his trigger finger. At least that's how he wanted to be seen by the police. The fact is, Lilo quoted Plato and spoke 4 languages. The fact that the drug dealers he worked with also spoke those languages was just a coincidence. Now, the mafia says you can't sell dope. Lilo read this a bit differently. Yeah, you can't sell drugs, but I ain't you. Lilo used narcotics to become what the press would call a super don. He was a criminal for his whole life and never gave the cops nothing but a hard time. In the 1970s, he took a shot at the title of boss of bosses. In the end, he would die a natural death. The natural death of a gangster. Hey, you guys, gals, and bums, and welcome back to A Few Bad Men. Hope everybody's doing well out there. Today, we're going to be talking about Carmine Galante, one of the most feared men in mafia history, and that's saying a lot. So I don't want to do too much talking. We got a lot to cover, so let's get into this. Camillo Carmine Galante was born February 21st, 1910, in a tenement on Stanton Street on the Lower East Side of Manhattan, to Vincenzo and Vincenza Galante, their second child. While still a baby, the family moved, and Lilo grew up in East Harlem, what they now call Spanish Harlem. He was another one of those badass little kids running around wild in the streets. When he was 11, Lilo was running in the streets and was hit by a car. He was knocked unconscious and taken to the Poet Graduate Hospital with a brain injury. Maybe this accident gave him amnesia, because a few months later, he was hit again while running in the streets. This time when he was hit, the car rolled over one of his legs and broke his ankle. None of these things would deter young Carmine. He was a gangster in training. It was in his blood. Carmine Galante was born a Bonanno before the Bonanno family existed in America. His father, Vincenzo Galante, came from Castellammare del Golfo. Back in Castellammare, the Bonannos were mafia royalty. Joe Bonanno's father was a boss, as was his father. Vincenzo Galante, a fisherman back in Castellammare, was loyal to the Bonanno family back in Sicily. Lilo started his training early. He was the leader of a gang of young hoods who robbed pushcarts and extorted kids for money. At 10, he was caught stealing a trinket and was placed on juvenile probation. He was sent to a reform school for a year. Lilo also attended Public School 79 and Public School 120, up to the 7th grade when he left school for good at 15 years old. Over the next few years, Carmine grew his little crew, which now included lifelong pals Joseph Di Palermo, known as Joe Beck, and his brother Charles Di Palermo, and Carmine's cousin Angelo Lil Mo Presenzano. Carmine was arrested many times and gave many names. At some time in the late 20s, Lilo and his gang graduated to armed robbery. On March 16, 1930, Lilo got a chance to use his educated trigger finger. That evening, Lilo and 3 other men were in the elevator of the Weinstein Shoe Company at 35 York Street in Brooklyn. They were headed to the 6th floor where Philip Weinstein was dividing $7,500 into envelopes to pay his employees. It was payday. With him were 3 women, and acting as security was police officer Walter Di Castilla of the Poplar Street Station. Di Castilla had accompanied Weinstein to the bank and back to the warehouse where he now kept guard. When Lilo and the boys hit the 6th floor, one of the men pulled the gun and put it to the elevator operator's ribs and told him to stay calm. The rest headed to the office and busted in. Di Castilla jumped up, but before he could draw his weapon, shots rang out. 6 shots were fired at Di Castilla, hitting him once in the chest and twice in the stomach. Lilo and his boys then ran out of the room, leaving the women screaming, Weinstein in shock, and $7,500 on the table. They went back downstairs to a waiting car and made tracks. Di Camillo would die on the spot, leaving a wife and 4 children. But why kill a cop and leave the dough? Maybe the dough wasn't the job. Di Castilla had a reputation for being a straight cop, and he had pissed off some bad men. Lilo and his men were not sent there as thieves, but as assassins. Galante would be free until October 1930, when he was arrested and charged with taking part in the payroll murder. On October 3rd, 1930, he was brought before Magistrate Leo Haley, but without evidence, he was released. On his way back to Manhattan, his car was overtaken by a car full of police officers on the Manhattan Bridge. He was rearrested and taken to the New Jersey Avenue police station, where he was charged with being one of the 5 men who held up the Prudential Insurance Company at 72 Pennsylvania Avenue in Brooklyn on May 6th. On that night, Lilo and his gang walked into the Prudential offices and forced the manager and employees to stand against the wall while they stole $1,000 in cash and some jewelry. The charges were later dropped, but Lilo was determined to go to jail, and his gang continued their armed robbery spree until Christmas Eve, 1930. Hundreds of Christmas shoppers crowded the streets of Williamsburg, Brooklyn on December 24th, 1930. The mood was festive, but 5 men were determined to play the role of the Grinch. Detective Joseph Meehan was returning from the Climate Street station from lunch when 4 suspicious men loitering around a delivery truck attracted his attention. As he crossed Diggs Avenue and 9th Street to investigate, shots rang out. The group of men opened up on the officer, hitting him in the leg. He fell to the ground, pulled his revolver, and returned 6 shots at the gangsters, knocking one of them off the running board of the truck that they were escaping in. When the shooting started, people scattered, but 6-year-old Shirley Gershowitz caught some lead in the leg. As the wounded gunman got up and tried to run, Officer Richard Flynn apprehended him, and the wounded man gave his name as Carmine Galante. Later that day, 2 more of Lilo's gang would go to different hospitals to get treated for gunshot wounds. They too were arrested. Carmine said nothing to the police, but he didn't have to. He was sentenced for 10 years in Great Meadows Prison in upstate New York. Carmine Galante used his time in prison to reflect on his life, become religious, and learn. One of the things he learned was how to make a shank. And on January 27, 1933, he would get to use it. While in the yard, on their way to the shops, all hell broke loose. 6 men began a brawl, and before the guards could break it up, a homemade prison knife found its way into the chest of Joseph Delgado, 28 years old, serving 10 to 20 on manslaughter. Also wounded was Salvatore Agro, serving time for second-degree assault, and Carmine Galante. They both suffered from injuries that were not serious. Delgado would not be so lucky. He would die of his wounds the next morning. 3 other men were punished for participating in this fight. It came out that Agro was wounded trying to defend Delgado, and I'm not sure which side Carmine was on, but it appeared to be on the losing side. Galante spent the rest of his time in the joint relatively quiet. But one thing that came out of it, when he was interviewed by the prison psychiatrist, he wrote in his report that Lilo had a psychopathic personality. No kidding. Carmine got out on May 1st, 1939. He got a job, at least on paper, at an artificial flower factory, and later as a handyman at the Knickerbocker Trucking Company at 320 Broadway. By 1942, his parole records say that he was a member of the International Longshoremen's Association, Local 856. These were all fronts. Lilo's real job was being a gangster. Now, Prohibition ended in 1933, but there was still money to be made in illegal alcohol. In 1939, Lilo was caught operating an illegal still at 71 Windsor Avenue in Inwood, Long Island, and he was sent back for a few months on a parole violation. In 1943, when he got out, World War II was well underway, and that meant gas rationings and nightly blackouts in New York. On January 11th, 1943, Galante went to see his parole officer. His parole officer felt that Lilo was acting nervous and seemed in a rush to get out of there. The officer became suspicious, and when Lilo left the office, he had him tailed. The officer who followed him saw him get into a sedan with 2 other men and drive off. The officer wrote down the license plate of the car, but was not allowed to follow due to gas restrictions. Later that evening, Carlo Tresca was on his way from dinner back to his office on 5th Avenue. Tresca was the publisher of the anti-fascist newspaper Il Martello, The Hammer. He was exiled from Italy in 1904 for radical agitation. He moved to the U.S. and settled in Pittsburgh, where he caused more trouble and eventually got his throat slit because of it. He would survive, but he never folded. He did 4 months in jail for distributing information about birth control, but was pardoned by President Calvin Coolidge. He moved to New York and continued his activism. Tresca and Benito Mussolini met in Switzerland in 1904 while they both were exiles. And Mussolini did not make a good first impression on the fiery Tresca. When Mussolini took control of Italy in 1922, Tresca was one of his biggest critics. On January 11, 1943, Tresca was in his car with his partner Giuseppe Calabi. They parked the car, got out, and began to walk up Fifth Avenue towards the office. All of a sudden, a car pulled up, a man jumped out, and shots rang out. 4 shots were fired at Tresca, only one connected, but it was enough. Tresca was hit in the head, knocking his trademark sombrero hat to the ground. He dropped to the sidewalk dead. The shooter jumped back in the car and took off. Several people witnessed the shooting, including Calabi, but because of the blackouts, they could not get a good look at the shooter. When the car used by the shooters was found a few blocks away, the description matched that of the car the parole officer saw Lilo get into. The officer got in touch with the police and suggested that Lilo was involved. The police arrested Lilo and brought him into the station. They took him into a room with 3 chairs, a table, and a single light bulb. But the movie-style Third Degree had no effect on Lilo. The police would have had a better chance getting a statement from Tresca. Where did you go after you left the parole officers? I went to the movies. What did you see? Casablanca. What was the movie about? I don't remember. What did you do after the movies? I went to see Abroad. What was her name? Don't remember. The interrogation went on for hours. Lilo didn't budge. He just drank black coffee and smoked cigars. Because he was on parole, he was sent to the tombs to rot. The car that was found had been wiped completely clean of fingerprints. Galante was brought in for a lineup, but Calabi could not pick him out. The authorities knew that he was involved, but they just didn't have the evidence. Lilo sat in the tombs for 8 months. The DA asked the judge to revoke his parole, and the judge agreed. Lilo was sent to Clinton Correctional Facility to serve out the remaining time on his 10-year sentence. Now, I want to take a second to talk about this Tresca murder. Now, there are several mob theories about why Tresca was killed. The first one I learned was that Vino Genovese, who was at Italy at the time, was pals with Mussolini, and he had Tresca killed as a favor. Other sources say it was Costello who did the favor for the dictator. Here's the thing. If Lilo was the shooter, according to mob rules, he would have to get permission from his boss, who was Joe Bonanno. Like Tresca, Joe Bonanno had no love for Mussolini. He was the reason Joe was in America and not Sicily. So for Lilo to kill someone as a favor for Mussolini doesn't add up to me. All right. But why did he kill Tresca? Well, Tresca had made a lot of enemies over the years, and one of them was Bonanno captain Frank Garofalo. Tresca made some disparaging remarks in an article about Garofalo and a female friend who was not his wife after running into them at a party. And that's why he was hit. To me, that makes more sense than Lilo just being a political assassin. According to the FBI files, Lilo spent his time locked up with a man whose name is redacted, but only says that he was the top hoodlum in New York. That could only be Charlie Lucky. If you wanted to know about the dope game, you couldn't find a better teacher. In addition to his 8 months in the tomb, Lilo did a year. This time when he got out on December 24th, 1944, he learned his lesson and went straight. Nah, he got caught in September 1947 outside of a house at 5 Berkeley Place in Brooklyn, loading a disassembled alcohol still into a Cadillac. His pal Joey Beck, Nicholas Palmiato, and John Longo, the tinsmith who built the still, were taken in. Lilo was charged with operating an illegal still, and he was given a suspended sentence. Illegal booze wasn't the only racket Carmine and his boys were up to. They had the gangster staples like bookmaking, shylacking, numbers, and burglary. In December 1948, several members of Lilo's gang tunneled their way into Rocco Cariccia's travel agency and stole $50,000 in traveler's checks, which they later passed around New York $10 at a time. A little over a year later, one of the men who took part in the robbery, Dominic Idone, 24, was at his New Year's party with his family when he received a phone call around 1:30 a.m. He told his family that he was going to see his brother who lived 2 blocks away. Dominic left his home at 171 Mulberry and began to walk the 2 blocks to his brother's house. When he got to his brother's block, a man walked up to him, pulled the gun, and backed him into a hallway across the street at 217 Mulberry. Dominic would be found 2 hours later with 5 extra holes in him. On February 21st, 1950, Galante's crew was brought in for the murder. Joe Beck's little brother Charles D. Palermo, Louis Gigi Arminante, Joseph Mistrietta, and Salvatore Magrino. The cops were looking for Joe Beck too, but he was in the wind. Now, history and the books say that Lilo did this hit. They loved to paint him as bloodthirsty, and he was no doubt a violent man, but this was not questioned. Now, we don't know when Lilo became a made member in the Bonanno family, but like Charlie Lucky and Vito Genovese got made into Joe Masseria's family by killing Umberto Valente in 1922, to me, it seems like the killing of Tresca earned Lilo his button. Up until then, he was an associate, maybe, but he did not participate in the Castellammarese War from 29 to 31. He was doing stick-ups. He didn't go to jail until January 31 during the height of the war and 4 months before Joe's last trip to Coney Island. But no one alive knows when he was made. So, and that's the fun thing, to try to get around the myths and the legends and understand the truth as much as possible. And that's why I do these videos. All right. The point I'm trying to make is Lilo had a crew now, and he didn't need to do the dirty work for himself. In the end, it didn't matter. The cops had nothing on the men, and they were released. Another thing Carmine did when he got out in the mid-40s was he got married. He met a woman working for a radio station named Helen Maruli. They were married a few months later, and Lilo bought a home on Marcy Avenue in Brooklyn. They would eventually have 3 children together, and Helen's brother, Anthony Maruli, became a member of Lilo's crew. In 1950, Lilo found another woman he wanted to marry. So he did, but not legally. Her name was Anne Aquavella. He put her up in a house in Pelican Island, New Jersey, and told her that his name was Samuel Costa. He would have 2 more children with her. Anne would later say that her husband was a very busy man and sometimes stayed away for days or weeks at a time for work. In the 1950s, Lilo was sent to Montreal by his boss, Joe Bonanno. He opened several businesses to use as fronts, including the Bonfire restaurant with Harry Shipp and Louis Greco. Castellammarese gangsters had a presence in Montreal for years. By the mid-50s, Montreal was seen as the most corrupt city in Canada. Good place to be if you're a criminal. So he petitioned the Canadian government to allow him to move there permanently. But when they found out about his criminal record, they denied his requests. Over the next few years, he would make several trips to Montreal. Sometimes he announced himself, sometimes he didn't. He had big business in Montreal, and the fact that the Canadian government put the word out that he was not welcome was not going to stop him. In 1955, the feds were well aware that Lilo was up to something. It seemed that Lilo had a lot more money than a handyman or a longshoreman should have, and they began to follow his every move. One of the gangsters he was seen consorting with was Joseph Barbera, a member of the Castellammarese clan who operated in upstate New York and lived in a small town called Appalachian. In October 1956, mafia leaders met in Appalachian in a hotel near Joe Barbera's, and Carmine Galante was present. A few days before this meeting, the FBI files showed that a man named Salvatore Tanabe was overheard on a wiretap telling someone to call, redacted, and get together with Lilo, and then he gave the number to Joe Barbera's house. On October 18th, Lilo was in a hurry to get back from Barbera's and was pulled over for doing 70 and a 50 in a small town in New Jersey. When the cops pulled him over, they asked his name. Lilo said Joe Di Palermo and gave them Joe Beck's driver's license. The cop noticed that Lilo didn't match the physical description on the license. The cop felt something wasn't right, and he took Lilo to the station where he was fingerprinted, and they found out what his real name was. And then he was charged with speeding, driving without a license, and using someone else's driver's license. On November 9th, Galante pleaded guilty to the charges and was sentenced to 30 days in jail and a $150 fine. In 1957, the winds of change were blowing in the American mafia. The commission formed in 1931 kept things relatively peaceful, meaning there were no wars between gangs, not that people didn't get killed. No one had the title of boss of bosses. The commission shared power and delegated enforcement of the rules. For 25 years it worked. The problem with having an organization made of criminals is criminals are not known for following the rules. All it takes is for one guy who understands that a well-placed bullet can end any dispute. In 1957, that man was Vito Genovese. Vito decided that it was time for a new boss of bosses, and he felt that no man was better suited for the job than him. The backbone of his power would be narcotics. Vito wasn't new to the dope game. He had been selling dope since the 20s along with his boss, Charlie Lucky. Vito's first order of business was to become boss in his own family. He had been the boss back in 1937 before he took off to Europe running from a murder charge. Now he was just a captain. The top job was currently occupied by Frank Costello. Frank had a lot of power and a lot of money, but he also had a lot of legal problems at the time and was living like he was a businessman and not a gangster. On May 2nd, 1957, Vito reminded Frank what business he was really in. Vito sent his driver and future boss, Vincent the Chin Gigante, to kill Frank. The Chin only succeeded in killing Frank's fedora, but Frank got the message and he retired. The next biggest gangster at the time was Albert Anastasia. Who killed Albert is up to debate and for another story. But on October 25th, 1957, he went to the barbershop, sat in a chair, and got clipped. Now, everything was set up for Vito to become the boss of bosses. A little over 2 weeks later, over 100 mafioso from all over the country, Canada and Cuba, met at Joe Barbera's house in Appalachian. In attendance were Carmine Galante and Joe Bonanno. The presence of 100 gangsters in a small town got the attention of local police, and they raided Barbera's house. Big-time hoodlums ran through the woods in expensive suits and Italian leather shoes. It was a whole big deal. I got to do a follow-up video on the fiasco in Appalachian, but a long story short, Joe Bonanno was one of the many men caught. But Lilo, who was familiar with the surroundings, was not. He was able to hide until the cops left and returned to the Barbera's house, where he was hidden until the heat was off. The history books say that this meeting was set up so that Carlo Gambino could be named as the new boss of the Anastasia family, and Vito could explain why he hit him. But in reality, this meeting was to get everyone up to speed on narcotics. Now, to understand this, we need to go back 2 weeks before the Anastasia hit on October 25th, 1957. In early October 1957, Galante and Joe Bonanno attended a meeting between Sicilian Mafia, American Mafia, and Corsican smugglers in the Grand Hotel at the Palmes in Palermo to discuss what would be known as the French Connection. They would buy pure opium from Turkey and the Middle East, ship it to Corsica where it would be processed and smuggled into Montreal, sent down the Hudson River to New York, and from there to the rest of the country. The Bonannos, and in particular Lilo, handled the Montreal part of the deal. Carmine's role in the operation must have been significant. In 1958, he was stopped again for speeding. This time he tried to bribe the cop with $1,000 to let him go. He was arrested. Businessmen, politicians, and judges all fought to get him out. Nobody wanted Lilo to sit in jail. He was too valuable. Lilo was named concierge by Joe Bonanno sometime around 56, 57. And they took a trip together to Sicily in 1958. They met with Charlie Lucky in Palermo and went home to Castellamare del Golfo, where Lilo recruited Sicilian mafioso to join him in America. These Sicilians would be known as the Zips. The Zips were ruthless. They didn't follow the American Mafia's rules of engagement, where innocent people, politicians, and judges were off limits. The Zips didn't care. They would kill anyone that stood in their way. They were led by a gangster named Cesare Bonaventure. They would be loyal to Lilo and become his personal army. Lilo was ready. No one would fuck with him now, so he thought. In 1958, Vito Genovese was hit with a federal indictment for narcotics. Lilo was also named in the indictment, and he went on the lam. Vito will be found guilty and sentenced to 15 years. He would never see the streets again. While Lilo was on the run, he was hit with a separate indictment for narcotics in New York. He was eventually captured after a year when federal narcotics agents and New Jersey troopers bagged him on the Garden State Parkway. He was taken to the Newark station where he was grilled for hours, but all they got from Lilo was cigar smoke blown in their face. Lilo was released on $100,000 bail. He would later turn himself in to face the charges on the indictment he shared with Genovese. During his New York trial, Lilo was hit with contempt charges after an outburst in the courtroom. He was sentenced to 20 days, but he was already being held in jail during his trial because he was seen as a flight risk, so it didn't really matter. In 1962, Carmine Galante was found guilty of conspiracy to distribute narcotics and was sentenced to 20 years in federal prison. While Lilo was in prison, the organization he helped to create ran without him. By the end of the 60s, the number of addicts in America had more than tripled. The mafia itself was undergoing a change. Vito Genovese, who was in jail, Charlie Lucky, Tommy Lucchese, Joe Pavasci would all die in the 60s. Joe Bonanno would take his shot at the title of Boss of Bosses, leading to the Bonanno War. He would come out on the losing side, but his life was spared, and he was exiled to Tucson, Arizona. The commission named Gaspar Di Gregorio as the new Bonanno boss. And by the beginning of the 1970s, Carlo Gambino was the most powerful gangster in America. For most 50-year-old gangsters, a 20-year sentence would be the end of the story. Not for Lilo. Lilo became the boss of the mafioso in prison with him and kept him in line. He spent his time working out in the yard, and he was the king of the handball court. There was one rule on the handball court: Lilo always wins. For 15 years, Lilo sat planning his return and stewing in his hatred. He hated Carlo Gambino. He hated Agnello Della Croce, Gambino's underboss, and he really hated Frank Costello. In order for him to take the crown, they would all have to go. Tony Eberle was the boss of the Bonannos for a while, but he died right before Lilo got out in January 1974. In March of 74, the Carlo Gambino-led commission made the first move to limit Lilo. They named Philip Rusty Rastelli as the new boss of the Bonanno family. Galante did not take long to let his disapproval be known. On March 6, 1974, Rusty's stepson, James Fernandez, was found by his wife with 4 extra holes in his head. Carmine was letting everyone know that he was back and he was the boss. Fuck the commission. He was determined to settle all grudges, and this was a threat to the living and the dead. Like I said, Carmine Galante hated Frank Costello. For what reason, I don't know. And Lilo was really pissed when he found out that Frank had died a year before he got released. But he was not going to let the Grim Reaper rob him of the pleasure of killing Frank Costello. On January 26, 1974, Frank Costello was in his granite mausoleum at the St. Michael's Cemetery in Queens, resting peacefully. At around 10:30 p.m., a homemade bomb exploded and rocked the Queens neighborhood. The bronze door of the mausoleum was blown off and twisted by the dynamite. Frank's remains were left undisturbed, and Lilo celebrated. Carmine was headed for war, but he was not ready. The Bonanos were the smallest of the families in New York, according to the FBI. It had about 200 made men and associates compared to the Gambinos, who had around 1,000, and the Genovese family, who had around 600. Lilo had the zips, but they would not be enough. He needed allies. He reached out to the Gallos on Elizabeth Street in Brooklyn. Now, the Gallos were technically with the Colombo family, but they had been fighting the civil war against family leadership since the 60s. And like Lilo, they pretty much had their own small family of around 100 guys. The Gallos were now run by the last remaining brother, Albert Kid Blast Gallo. Lilo asked if it came down to war, which side would the Gallos be on? After a 3-hour meeting, Kid Blast let him know that he would think about it. In 1975, Lilo got his answer when Albert Gallo transferred over to the Genovese family. In 1976, Philip Rosselli went away for extorting lunch truck operators. He would run his half of the Bonanno family from prison. On October 15, 1976, the Grim Reaper again robbed Lilo, when Carlo Gambino, the boss of bosses, died of natural causes. The press assumed that Lilo would be the new boss of bosses, but new Gambino leader Paul Castellano, his underboss in Yellow Della Croce, and current Genovese family boss Funzi Thierry aligned to stand in his way. Over the next few years, Lilo would chip away at the Bonanos loyal to Rusty Rosselli, as well as the Gambinos and the Genovese. He challenged their power on every front and in every racket he could. He was becoming a major pain in the ass to the commission. He sent men to California to try to break the Gambino hold on adult movies. Back east, he was putting pressure on pizza shops in Pennsylvania. The Gambinos had a lock on the mozzarella cheese business, and Lilo wanted in. He sent men into pizza shops, and they told the owners that Gambino cheese was not good for their health. Some guys folded. Others were still more afraid of the Gambinos than they were of Lilo. So Lilo had to convince them. On January 7th, 1977, Lilo sent 22-year-old Vincenzo Fiordalino and another hoodlum to Giuseppe's Pizza restaurant in Ambler, PA, to send a message. The 2 men broke into the shop after hours and began to spread gasoline all around the place. Then, one of them lit a match. In seconds, the entire place went up into flames before the men could escape, leaving the would-be arsonists trapped. Their charred remains will be found the next day by firemen and police. Fiordalino, whose father was an associate of Joe Bonanno's, was identified, but the other guy was so badly burned, he was never identified. Even though the plan didn't go exactly the way he wanted it, the message was received, and pizza joints in PA started to use Lilo's cheese. Lilo began to make alliances with bosses across the country, Canada and Mexico. He reunited with his Corsican suppliers and got connected with suppliers from East Asia. He sent men to Colombia to establish a cocaine line with the cartels, and a few black and Hispanic dealers in Harlem came up dead. Bookmakers and Shylocks kicked up or went out of business, and 2 Gambino soldiers, Carmine Consalvo and his brother Francis, got tossed out of windows a few months apart. The commission wanted him dead, but his biggest problem was the law. Back in 1975, Joe Beck, Lilo's friend, was in Baylor Hospital in Dallas. Lilo went to visit his friend and was seen by agents from the Dallas office of the FBI doing surveillance. In 1977, Lilo was charged with consorting with known criminals, a violation of his parole. See, back in New York, Lilo was able to do whatever he wanted because his parole officer was on the payroll. But this was different. Lilo was sent back to jail for a few months. When he got out, he was hit with another subpoena, this time to appear in front of a grand jury in Miami. Lilo went to Miami and took the stand and gave them nothing but the fifth. He didn't answer any of their questions. He even took the fifth when they asked him his name. Apparently, just admitting that he was Carmine Galante was incriminating himself. He was hit with a contempt of court charge and was set free on $50,000 bail. For 2 years, Lilo was in and out of jail for violations of his parole. During one of those stints, the FBI got word that it was a hit out on Lilo. They told Lilo that he was going to be moved to another prison. He said, for what? For your own protection, they said. It wouldn't be until March of 1979 that Lilo was finally released. He was out on $50,000 bail, pending a resolution. He claimed that his parole had been revoked illegally. Upon his return to New York, Lilo resumed his campaign to be the boss of bosses. January 7, 1979, Genovese soldier John Macchiaroli was sitting in a bar that he owned, the Bright Eye Bar at 7223 Elliott Avenue. He was having a drink and talking to the bartender when a tall man in a ski mask walked in, and shots rang out. Cesare Bonaventure put 5 bullets into the back of Macchiaroli's head and walked out into a car and fled the scene. John was the second in his family to be murdered in the last year. His father, Pasquale Macchiaroli, Patty Mac, was killed in March of 1978. He disappeared and his body was found in the trunk of his 1977 Lincoln Continental in a supermarket parking lot in Brooklyn. By the summer of 1979, Lilo was on borrowed time. His enemies decided that if the government couldn't take him off the board, they would remove him the old-fashioned way. Rusty Rastelli met with current acting boss Joe Messina in prison. He instructed Messina to get permission from the commission to hit Galante. Even Joe Bonanno was given the courtesy of a vote. The commission voted to end Lilo's run for good. The commission put one-time Anastasia crew member, an extremely dangerous man in his own right, and Yellow Della Croce on the job. Lilo and Della Croce had been going back and forth, dropping bodies over the last few years, and had no love for each other. Della Croce gave a contract to Bonanno captain Alphonse Sonny Red and Delicato. Sonny Red put together the hit team. To keep it in the family, Sonny tapped his son Bruno and Delicato to be one of the shooters. Lilo knew he was on the spot and began to move like it. He was hardly ever seen without his zip bodyguards, Cesare Bonaventure and Baldo Amato, who he treated like sons. But on January 12, 1979, Lilo was driven to Joe and Mary's Italian restaurant at 205 Knickerbocker Avenue in Bushwick, Brooklyn, by his nephew, James Galante. And they were joined by his cousin, Angelo Lil Mo Prestenzano. Joe Turano, the Joe and Mary's, was Lilo's cousin, and he and his wife were leaving the next day for Italy. The get-together was a going-away party for the couple. In addition to Joe and Mary, their son Johnny and daughter were also there. They walked through the restaurant and went to the back patio where they ate appetizers and drank wine. At about 2:30 p.m., Cesare Bonaventure arrived with Bonanno soldier Leonardo Coppola. They too walked through the restaurant and made their way to the back patio and joined the party. At around this time, Lilo's cousin Little Mo said that he needed to stretch his legs and he was going to take a walk. He was seen pacing back and forth in front of the restaurant until a blue Ford Mercury pulled up. Then he turned and walked down the street. 5 men got out of the car wearing ski masks and carrying shotguns and handguns. They walked to the door of Joe and Mary's. 4 of the men went inside. The 5th took a position on the sidewalk. 1 man stopped just inside of the door. The remaining 3 men made their way to the patio. Joe's son Johnny, who was on the phone behind the counter, saw the men come in. The man who stayed downstairs told him to get off the phone. Johnny dropped the phone and took off to warn the man on the patio. He caught a slug in the back for his troubles. Lilo was in the process of lighting a cigar when he heard the shots, and the 3 assassins made their way to the patio. Before he could say a word, shots rang out. A shotgun blast knocked Lilo out of his chair onto his back. Then Bruno and Delicato put another bullet under his left eye, leaving it hanging from his socket. When the shooting started, Cesare Bonaventure stood up, pulled his gun, and joined in on the hit. He put several more slugs into Lilo. Leonardo Coppola had half of his head blown off by double-aught buckshot and died instantly. Lilo's cousin Joe Turano was hit several times in the neck, shoulders, and face. The shooters returned to their car, and the Mercury screeched up Knickerbocker Avenue movie style. Cesar Bonaventure was seen walking briskly away from the restaurant. When the police arrived, they found Lilo dead with a cigar clenched between his teeth and his pinky ring in the air. A few feet away was Coppola, also dead. Joe Turano was still alive and taken to the hospital, but he was DOA. John Turano, his son, was also taken to the hospital in serious but stable condition and will make a full recovery. At the time of the shooting, the FBI had video surveillance on the Ravenite Social Club, near Della Croce's headquarters. A few hours after Lilo was rubbed out, they observed Bruno and Delicato pull up, get out, and get congratulated by Della Croce and other Gambino soldiers. Carmine Galante was the last of the old-school gangsters. Maybe it was just his time to go. Over the next few years, infighting weakened the family, and Carmine was spared the embarrassment that came when it came to light that the Bonannos had let an FBI agent infiltrate their family. This would lead to the Bonannos losing their seat on the commission. He was spared the commission trial, and I think that he would have been disappointed that someone talked and Bruno and Delicato was convicted of his murder in 1986. Unlike the Tresca hit, where there were no prints found. The blue mercury that was used in the hit was found a few blocks away, a few hours later. On the roof of the car was a palm print. That print was later matched to Bruno's. That and the testimony cooked him. In the end, I think that Lilo went out the way he always thought he would, in a storm of bullets and cigar smoke. And that, my friends, is the skinny on Carmine, Lilo, Galante. I hope you guys enjoy the story as much as I enjoy telling it. This video has graphic images I can't show you on YouTube, so head over to the Patreon channel if you want to see those, or join YouTube membership and become a top earner. You can see the videos there too. I can put them on there without worrying about them being demonetized. All right, so guys, I have an assignment for you. All right, I need you guys to share this video with someone you think might enjoy it. We're almost at 30,000 subscribers, but that subscribey gang is fighting back, and we've been stuck on the same number for a few weeks. And so I need your help to get to that mark, all right? Also, we're coming up on the channel's 2nd birthday, and I'll try to figure out something to celebrate it. It's been 2 years, and we've come a long way. So I want to thank you guys for your support from day one, all right? So remember, bump off that subscribe button, break that thumb, ring that bell, and set it for all notifications so you don't miss nothing. Okay? So, this has been A Few Bad Men. Keep your nose clean and don't take any wooden nickels. I see yous in the funnies.